Welcome, everybody. Welcome to the Ed Wood Summit podcast. It's been a little bit since I've been here with Joe Blevins. I think a couple months ago we talked about what was it we talked about? The last time we
Thor and
talked
his magic hammer. Thor
Thor
and
and
his
his magic hammer. That's right. So we talked about a couple of known Ed texts, texts that are attributed to Ed, right in the credit of those. Today, we're actually going to talk about one that is credited to a certain Caine Richmond. By the way, I'm Greg Dziawer, so host here at the Ed Wood Summit podcast. Been doing this since early 2021, a little sporadic and intermittent through 2022, but still at it, and hopefully can I can increase the volume here in literally because there's a lot of exciting news coming down the pike related to Ed Wood.
wow.
So much that I'm not even
Yep.
going to get into it right now because we have something really exciting to get into today, which is this story by
Yes,
a
we do.
gentleman named Caine Richmond. But first, I want to throw it over to my cohort at Ed Wood Wednesdays, the proprietor and founder of Ed Wood Wednesdays, Joe Blevins.
Hi, Greg. I'm glad to be back here again. It's been too long since we've done one of these, and I'm always excited when you send a text my way that is possibly Ed. And I really am psyched to talk about the one that you found this time because, boy, did you find a real doozy of an article this time.
Right. Cool. I didn't find it, so I'll give you the provenance of this one. So, about 4 or 5 years ago, a gentleman who was sharing a number of Ed Wood-related items with me graciously shared with me the text of a magazine called Tailgate from 1968. So it's credited to Bernel and Associates and 1968. So it's pre-pen. This is I surmise is pre-Pendulum. This is a magazine imprint that I can't find a whole lot of evidence. There's the Fetish and Films magazine is a little better known as potentially having Ed's work in it. Tailgate, you won't find anything out there that anybody anywhere has mentioned that Ed Wood's work may have been lurking in this magazine Tailgate. I think there was probably only one issue. There are three distinct texts in the issue. Two of them are articles. One of them actually posted at Ed Wood Wednesdays about a year ago with me just sort of tossing it out there and saying, and it's credited to Caine Richmond, as is the short story we're going to talk about today. The short story is in this same issue of Tailgate as that. So that was called Sappho, and it was a one-page article by quote unquote Caine Richmond. So very Ed-like, and that's the reason I posted it. And I surmise that's why the gentleman shared this text with me, because he had some insight that this was very likely written by Ed Wood. We'll get to our conclusions later, but the Sappho article, if you did check out that post, it does have a lot of ellipses. It mentions things like very common Woodian themes, such as how women will often leave their husbands for another woman because the husband isn't performing in the bedroom. So neglecting your
Yeah.
wife is one way to turn her into a lesbian. There's numerous ways, as a matter of fact, and the short story is going to bear that out as we get into this conversation. But do you want to talk a little bit more about Sappho, Joe? Because it's not the only time
Sure.
that he's brought up
No.
that as a
Uh,
subject.
Ed wrote about Sappho on a couple of different occasions. One in an article from about 1973 called Sappho Revisited, which is basically a kind of an encyclopedia entry about Sappho, but done sort of, in that Ed Wood sort of free associative way where it sounds like he's hearing all this stuff third hand, like he's hearing somebody who told it to somebody else, and now they're telling it to Ed, and now he's telling it to us. And he mentioned Sappho again, I believe, in an article called Time Out for Pleasure from 1975. And so when I was comparing Sappho Revisited to the Caine Richmond Sappho article, I saw that stylistically and thematically, they're very, very similar things. So Ed had a fixation on a few different historical figures, and Sappho is one of them.
Yep. Yep.
So Sappho is someone, along with Elizabeth Bathory and Albert Fish, I guess, and Sappho. It's a weird grouping, but those are people that Ed wrote about over and over again. So when you said that Caine Richmond had written an article about Sappho, I immediately was like, oh, hey, Ed wrote, Ed wrote a Sappho thing himself that's canon, a canonical Ed Wood article is about Sappho. So,
Right. So cool. So yeah, Sappho, lesbianism
yep.
generally a topic that he's a moth to the flame He
Oh
can't
yeah,
avoid that topic.
he loves it.
Perhaps this is, I am thinking off the top of my head here, Joe. I hadn't thought this previously. Perhaps more so, he writes more so about lesbianism than even transvestism. Or,
Well,
that's not
even when
worth
he writes
delving
now,
into,
as we'll,
maybe.
we'll see, even when
Oh,
he
there
writes about
it's
lesbianism, he writes
yes,
about
sure,
transvestism.
sure. So yeah, they do conflate, definitely, and conflation actually is the right word for what's going on in this story we're going to talk about.
Sure, sure.
So the story is titled Lespad,
Okay.
Lespad, Lespad. Or at first when I read it, I thought, is it supposed to be some little Frenchy type of? Is
That's
it
what I thought. I was like,
Lepad?
Lepad was, I thought, what is this Lepad? Is this like
Right.
a French house or a French apartment?
All
Is a
right. I'm not the only
Lepad?
one who thought that.
Come
Good.
on to Lepad. Well,
Right.
in figuring out what the title actually was, helped me to figure out why this is an Ed Wood story. If you want me to, we can get into it with
I
that, but
I
figuring out the
I
title.
had this feeling. So I think if you're bearing out what my thought process was, go ahead, please. Yeah.
Well, in 1968, the year of this article, Ed wrote a novel called Nighttime Les, spelled Lez.
Right.
And when I saw Lepad, and then I figured out Lespad. Oh, okay, he's shortening down lesbian to les, and he's spelling it Les, which kind of makes sense because it's the word lesbian is spelled
Right.
Les. But generally, when it's shortened down to one syllable, we generally spell it Lez. So, yeah, the same year he wrote he wrote a whole novel called Nighttime Les, and in going back to Nighttime Les, the novel, I found a whole variety of parallels to this story. Basically, this story is a rewrite of things that happen in Nighttime Les.
Wow.
And basically, all the characters are from Night Les. The situations are from Nighttime Les. So this is
This is
basically this is basically a short story distillation of that novel.
this is why Joe Blevins is a frequent guest here at the Ed Wood Summit podcast, because he knows these encyclopedic knowledge about Ed's texts. I read
Of
Nighttime
Ed's.
Les. A lot of Ed's texts bleed
They
together in my
do.
mind.
That's why I wrote an article called Drowning in Ed Wood, where I just mainlined like, I don't know, 15 or 20 of his books in the course of about a month and a half. And it just all blends together
Right.
because he writes some of the same stuff over and over again. But I'd happened to do a more in-depth review of Nighttime Les because it contains one of Ed Wood's few Christmas stories. It's one of the few Ed Wood stories that takes place around Christmas.
Hmm.
And there's a long Christmas scene in Nighttime Les, not in this story, unfortunately. The Christmas spirit did not bleed over into this Caine Redmond, what was it, Caine
Caine
Richmond
Richmond. Yeah.
article. It didn't bleed over into that article, but there's a lengthy Christmas part in Nighttime Les. And so I wanted to find the most Christmassy thing that Ed Wood ever wrote. And I guess it's this novel. And so I had written a more of a thorough plot summary of that book. And so when I went back to my own review of it, I was like, oh my God, this thing, they're
Wow.
all in this, article. That's why I said, if it came down to it, I would to this story being Ed Wood in court. I would go
Court
under oath.
in
Uh,
court.
yep, I would
That's a bold
swear.
statement. I
I would.
agree. I use the pinky test, right? Would I clip off the tip of my pinky with a pair of garden shears? Would I bet the tip? I would bet the tip of my pinky. Would I bet my entire hand? I probably would. This is
On
clearly
this one, yes.
we've jumped to the conclusion. So thanks
Sorry.
everybody. Have a
Well,
good night.
okay, we'll get there though.
I
There's
know.
a
I'm
journey.
joking.
It's all about the journey, not the destination.
Right on. So that's great, Joe. That's a great catch. Yes, Nighttime Les did cross my mind, but I didn't put that together. I didn't put together that this was, by and large, same characters, similar circumstances, same story,
Yep.
etc. So it is a fairly lengthy story by
Yeah,
Ed's
for short story standards,
typical
yeah.
standards. I mean, it goes on for what occupies about 5 pages with a couple of pictures in the magazine, but it's 3 columns, and
Yeah,
so it's probably about 2,500, 3,000 words long, I
yeah.
would imagine, give or take. So fairly detailed story, a little more intricacy. It's a dialogue driven story.
It is.
I'm jumping ahead, so we need to outline the basic narrative
Sure.
of Le Pad. It's Les
Lepad
Pad.
or Lespad.
Les Pad. So go ahead if you want to give us a quick summary of it, Joe.
Well, it is about a young woman named Paula who is being indoctrinated into the world of lesbianism through the wild cocktail party scene that I'm not sure if this exists or how whether it exists or not, but Ed seems to think it exists. And she is under the wing of, now she is very much a femme lesbian. I think I would call her a fluff or but she is under the wing of a more butch lesbian named Tommy. And Tommy is introducing her around to different people at the party. And we meet the one male at the party who is Henry/Henrietta, the bartender. And he loves how wild and crazy these lesbian parties get. But the real action is when Paula meets a young woman named Jenny. And Jenny is more experienced in the lesbian world. And she knows all the people at the party. She's much more indoctrinated into this world and much more familiar with all the other lesbians than Paula is. Gives her a lot of the gossip about who's dating whom and who is being possessive of whom. And at first, Paula doesn't know what to make of Jenny. But as time goes on, as their conversation develops, and this is, as you said, a dialogue-driven story, it's a long conversation. They're getting along better and better. And eventually, let's say a love connection is made, and the story climaxes, figuratively and literally, with a love scene in a garden between Jenny and Paula. And I would like to compliment Ed here because this, if you're reading a lot of Ed's erotic fiction, a lot of it takes, it takes a left turn into sometimes violence or sadism or abuse or something horrible happens. But this is very much a consensual relationship. And the two women actually enjoy each other and like each other and are glad to be doing this. And the end of the story is kind of a lengthy, almost dreamlike description of their coupling out in nature.
Yeah.
And one thing that I thought was interesting here was that Ed sort of went the classier, more poetic route rather than sometimes he goes the, I guess, medical or gynecological route and describes things in a very, very, in terms of, well, there's always going to be some body fluids here. I think there is some,
I think saliva.
I think
Actually,
saliva.
There's references to
but
getting wet, a couple of references, yeah. But it's generally very, to your point, it's not gynecological. It's not in your face sexuality. It's painted as an idyllic, very idyllic sort of union between the two.
And it ended beautifully, which Ed must have been in a good mood that day when he wrote this one.
And relatively sober throughout, I also think.
Oh, right? Yeah, this is Ed really being coherent, and it gets a little bit dreamy and sort of drifting away toward at the end. And Ed does go into one of his tendencies, which is to maybe over-explain some things. This is very typical. The very end of it is very typical of Ed trying to say the same thing 2 or 3 different ways. Paula had the girl of her dreams, and that girl had her. The dreams were no longer dreams. They were the reality and would never be the mental pictures of hope again.
Right.
And
it has a certain cadence to it.
Yes, it does.
If you read enough Ed Wood, you recognize that cadence, and it's easy to sort of get swept up Maybe
Yes.
it's me, right? Maybe it's,
You
but
know,
you can get sort of swept up into it. He's a better writer than he's given credit for.
well, yes. One word I was starting to notice that Ed likes to use occasionally, instead of young, he likes to say youthful. He uses the word youthful. And then I remembered when I was reviewing every article in When the Topic is Sex, he had one called, I'm sorry to say, Youthful Boobs was the one. It was his article about brassieres. But he uses the word youthful through this one. But Eddie has a couple of great, um, he has a couple of great metaphors and similes in this thing. Um, well, especially when Jenny is talking about one of the other lesbians on the scene, another femme lesbian named Doris, and she's describing just what a fine thing this Doris is, and the descriptions are just chef's kiss. They're perfect. Her mouth is like tasting soft, warm, perfumed jello. She's got a pair of legs that could give a wrestler cauliflower ears.
Right.
And so,
Very vivid, very
well,
extremely
yes.
vivid, right?
Well, now, what really struck me is that this story is about a young woman's indoctrination into the world of lesbianism, which is exactly what Nighttime Les is about.
Mm-hmm.
The heroine of that novel is named Paula, which is the heroine of this story as well.
That's
Paula,
a name. Oh,
well,
go
that's
ahead.
an
You
Ed
were
name.
just right.
The thing about Ed's naming conventions, Ed loves nothing more than a female name that has an obvious male counterpoint or an obvious male version. So Glenn or Glenda, obviously, but Paul and Paula. And so I think one of the first Paulas in the Ed Wood canon is probably in the Violent Years.
Right.
So like all the one of the gimmicks in the Violent Years, it's about an all-girl gang, but all the girls in the gang have girl names that can easily be turned into guy names. So um, this is all about women acting as men, but we also have a man acting as a woman. So uh, this character of all the characters, basically all the major characters are from Nighttime Les, and they have the same basic role. Tommy is the bull dyke, and Sam is another bull dyke. And I believe Tommy and Sam run one of Ed's hated things,
The
a
beer
beer
joint.
joint. Uh, if you see a porno story, and Ed would, if you see a porno story from the 60s or 70s, and the characters are weirdly anti-beer,
There's
you,
an
you,
there's a
you
moment.
might be, go ahead.
Sorry. No, there's a moment later in the story where Jenny says to Paula, she goes, that as if a beer joint is the sleaziest kind of place you can go into. She makes reference to it, and like, I don't go into that kind of a place. And you've said it to perhaps here before that in Ed's world, a beer joint is like, is it just a sloshing around beer? Is that all it is? Right?
Yes.
It's
So,
obviously code for a sort of dive atmosphere, I think.
yeah,
Yeah.
beer bars and beer itself are usually mentioned with great contempt, but it is said in this novel that Tommy and Sam are running some kind of
Yeah.
beer joint, and Jenny gets a little dig in at Tommy for running the beer joint. Oh, I heard you got some kind of beer bar or some sort of beer joint going. And in the novel Nighttime Les, characters called Tommy and Sam are running a sleazy beer joint. And that's where Paula is first indoctrinated and first has her first lesbian experience in the storeroom in the back, which is something that's described in this one. And the thing that was most remarkable to me was this character of Henrietta, who is the one guy who dresses in drag and serves all the lesbians at the party. He is imported directly from Nighttime Les as well.
Jeez, I'm gonna have to read that
So,
again here, obviously, within the next few days.
and in the novel, Paula gets pregnant by her boss, but her boss can't marry her. So she has to marry somebody because she doesn't want the baby to be, without a father. So she ends up marrying Henrietta in the novel. So uh, if this seems all very far-fetched, that's Paula and Henrietta are headed. You In this, they just have a little dialogue and nothing really.
It
Uh,
it jumped
Go
into my
ahead.
head the other Caine Richmond piece in this issue of Tailgate, Sappho article, but at one point, as Ed is kind of, well, if it is in fact Ed, pretty confident on that score, but as he's delineating all the different ways that a woman would what would make a woman eventually become a lesbian. Like you're never sort of born a lesbian. There's a reason
No.
ultimately why you become one, so to speak. And one of the reasons is because a woman might be afraid of getting pregnant. Right.
Well, you see, that was that in the novel. That's Paula's problem. Well, she is kind of unapologetically sleeping her way up the corporate ladder. The reason why she's nighttime Les is that by daytime she's a secretary, and this was very much the era of sleeping with your secretary and blah blah blah. She's expected to sort of sleep with her bosses, and she's fine with that. That's just part of the job. And you get stuff like that in the movie Cocktail Hostesses with Renee Bond. You know, and again, when I said if Nighttime Les were made into a movie, I would have cast Renee Bond in the lead for that. And if this story were adapted, I probably would have cast Renee Bond for that. When I was reading this, I couldn't help but picture Renee in this. So
Interesting. I hadn't really pictured anybody. That's interesting. I'll
so
definitely
that's what I
do
mean.
that next time I read it.
Well, because she had been in this. You don't really, in this short story, you don't really get a sense of what Paula's daytime life is like. But
Right.
she's called Nighttime Les because she's got kind of a daytime life and then a nighttime life. And
interestingly, just as an aside, in Caine Richmond's article Sappho, Caine Richmond talks about while the husband is away at work during the day, the wife is engaged in lesbianism. I think he calls it the coffee clutch, KLUTCH. You'd have to go back and look that article is posted at Edward Wednesdays.
I noticed that he also mentions the Kinsey report here because Ed was obsessed with the Kinsey report and with Masters and Johnson. He was, and he even does a fake, version of his. I think what was his Spencer and West or something. He had some sort of thing where he's pretending to be two people writing a sex manual or a sex report.
Bloodiest sex crimes, I think, is Spencer and West, right? Yeah.
So, so that reference to the Kinsey report is another red flag. That's something that Ed was very much interested in. But now I'm curious because this story, like I said, if I would testify, I would swear on a stack of Bibles that this is Ed Wood. Well, then it becomes this this door that now is burst open, and now, oh no, there's going to be like there's cache of Caine Redmond stories.
It's never ending, right? It's baffling. It's baffling that all these years later, right? We're talking about
Caine Richmond.
I was born, by the way, in 1968. So short story written in 1968, 54,
well, you should have been
54 years later, potentially. And again, we're exhibiting a great deal of confidence that we both think this is absolutely, without doubt, written by Ed Wood. 54 years later, here's another, right?
Well, you should have as a baby asked your parents to take you out to the nearest dirty bookstore and get some of these books and magazines. You're never going to find them cheaper than that. Although these were not cheap at the time. I don't know what was the cover price on Tailgate, but I noticed that in the scan of this, you also included.
Well, the last page has a scan of an 8 millimeter, a couple of 8 millimeter shorts with Mickey and Bobby, right?
Bobby
sold
and
by
Mickey.
Cal Mail. Cal Mail is a frequent advertiser, obviously, in the Pendulum magazines as well. Cal Mail. And
you can get the black and white version for $15 and the 8 millimeter color version for $30. But you got to take all those prices and multiply them by about 10. So, you're talking $150, you're talking $300. So, if you're worried about the inflation of 2022, porn fans of the past, they had it way worse because these porno magazines and movies, especially, oh my God, you're paying right through the nose for those. So I was thinking $30. Wow, that would be. I mean, you couldn't even get people to pay $30 for an online in today's money for an online clip or something like that because there's
Curiously enough, in the marketplace now, these 8mm shorts can be purchased for considerably less. That's just how technology and time works, right?
well,
Uh,
you also would have to have.
you can get them for 10, $15. You can sometimes get these 8mm shorts. I have not begun collecting them, by the way. That would be a fucking
No,
rabbit
but
hole that I don't need to go down.
exactly. But that was the thing that was so finding a thing like this Caine Richmond is both a delight and a horror because like, how much could this guy possibly write? Um, you know, the thing that we don't talk about sometimes with Ed's writing is that first big burst of that first big novel that really started him on his way to being an adult writer. That was 1963. But
Black
then
Lace Drag, right?
yeah, but then there's like some fallow years, and then all of a sudden, like in the late 60s, things really start picking up. Well, I got to figure that during that gap, he's writing something.
I, of course, wholeheartedly agree and have really occupied the better part of the last 2 years of my life trying to
I
figure
know.
that out. In fact, next week's Edward Wednesdays, Joe doesn't even know this, but as a little preview, it's going to be another Summit podcast. I'm going to be joined by, just a little preview, Rob Huffman is going to, and we're going to talk
Oh,
about the
cool.
France books, which are France books and magazines, which are
Okay.
1962, 63. And there is potentially some evidence that Ed was writing there at that particular point in time. I think, Joe, I mean, to that point, I think there's all kinds of other Ed Wood texts floating around. I know I haven't shared it widely here at the podcast, but I know I've shared with you. There's at least 3 books, unknown Ed Wood paperbacks that are I'm very confident in right now that
Right.
again, I'll get around to sharing it. I'm not trying to hoard information,
No,
obviously.
but
Yeah.
this thing, I wondered, well, if once I figured out the nighttime Les connection, and even some of like the really supporting characters, like Doris, who is not even really in this story.
Right.
Doris is just being talked about. Doris is off stage, basically.
Doris is
Uh,
one of Tommy's conquests. I'm using that word. He doesn't use Ed doesn't use that
no, he
word.
doesn't
Like
say that.
Sam and Doris are both involved with Tommy. Right.
So Sam and Doris are both, yes, both, but Sam, I believe, is one of the butches, and then
Right.
Doris is one of the femmes.
The femmes, which
And
he doesn't actually use the word femme in this particular
no, he
story.
doesn't.
He uses, and this is commonplace, by the way, passive, right? The femme, so to speak, is the passive. There's the butch
Right.
and the in this case the passive. So Paula, I
Well,
guess, would be characterized as the passive, but she hooks up well, she hooks up with Jenny on this particular night. But it
well,
also says she over the course of the next 3 weeks after this takes place at just this one
oh yeah,
party during the course of one evening. She also makes arrangements to have 10 more hookups over the course of the next 3 weeks.
yeah,
So
because
so
there's
she
this.
she falls headlong
Oh
into
yeah,
this world of
well,
lesbianism.
that's what happens to Paula as well. But by the way, I want to point out that Jenny is spelled Jeni,
Right.
which is exactly how it's spelled in Nighttime Les. So that's another thing
Yeah.
that stood out. Um, the same thing happens basically to Paula, this that same named character in Nighttime Les. There's Nighttime Les is mainly a series of parties. You go from one party to the next party to the next party, and then the thing is, because it's a novel, she also goes to work in between those parties. Um, so you get both halves of her. I guess you get both halves of her life. But in this story, it even starts with the line, "When in Rome, do as the Romans do." And when I was reviewing all the articles from when the topic is sex, "When in Rome," I believe, is one of Ed's articles from
Right.
that. But if that didn't sell me, and that's the first sentence, uh, you know what the first thing he does in describing both Paula and Jenny is this is very, very typical. This is the thing that Ed Wood loves to do when describing his female characters, is describing what they're wearing. Um, that is another sign that you're often dealing with Ed,
Yep.
is if there is an inordinate amount of attention paid to what the characters are wearing.
He uses the
To
word
what
finery at some
the
point later in the
yes,
story. That's a very
the fluff and the
typical keyword,
finery,
right?
like fluff and the finery. Oh, and the phrase sweater and skirt. He always
Right.
likes that combination, or just a sweater and skirt. So
Will
that's
not
why
be denied is another
well,
sort of ed phraseology. Someone will not be denied their,
well,
desires in this case. Yeah.
I've said that the Rosetta Stone for understanding Ed Wood is still Glen or Glenda. And Glen or Glenda has the fluff and the finery in it. It has a sweater and skirt in it. Um, and, it has that, where Dr. Alton is talking about sex changes, man to woman, woman to man. And Ed likes to have that kind of symmetry. He likes to have that here, where the boys are dressing like girls and the girls are dressing like boys.
Which is, you're almost verbatim. That's right from the story. Yeah, again, that symmetry.
Yeah, he loves to have those. He loves to have those matched up. Um, so yeah, and I guess the other thing that's very typical of Ed, and this is all through his basically erotic writing career, both is that you have sort of the unschooled innocent who is going around and being introduced to people, and is I was thinking today, gosh, I don't know why this particular story popped into my mind today, but Pekka at the circus, which is Ed at his maybe his most explicit. But even Pekka at the circus, Pekka is, I don't think of like a virgin or anything by the time we meet Pekka in Pekka at the circus, but Pekka is taken around, the circus and introduced to various people with whom he will have, sexual liaisons in the very, very near future. So that story is very much an indoctrination. And I don't know. I keep saying indoctrination makes it sound very
Yeah,
negative.
Paul is going forth, eyes wide open, willingly, right?
Yes.
So let's not construe from that. I agree. Indoctrination might
Yeah.
sound like other people have some machinations. Tommy perhaps has some some
Well,
manipulative angle on Paula, but really just because
no. Yeah. Tommy.
she wants to sleep with her, right?
Well, yeah. But
Yeah,
Paula seems to be determined to declare her own independence.
right.
She is not going to be controlled by Tommy, and maybe in the future, I guess not by Jenny either. But she wants everyone to know, I'm my own person. I am not one of Tommy's little pets. I'm not going to follow her around and do what she tells me to do. So that's good. Maybe again, maybe this is 1960s Ed here. And we see another little pet right there.
It's Ivy. Ivy, of course, needs to make her appearance here she hasn't been
Well,
here at the
yes,
Edward Summit podcast in a little while. Ivy,
another recurring,
there you go.
recurring star of the Edward Summit podcast. But so this is Ed in the 1960s. So maybe Ed is a little bit more optimistic here, a little less embittered by life. When you get down into his 1970s short stories and his articles and novels, oftentimes there's a very ugly undercurrent to them. Even in the aforementioned Cocktail Hostesses, the film script, which is basically, it's about a young woman who's sleeping with her boss. She's not making enough money. She decides to become a cocktail hostess. By the way, alcohol is another one of Ed's motifs, and it's right here. Of course, you have to have the booze. I think strong martinis in this one.
Yeah, we get the impression that Henry, aka Henrietta, pours them pretty stiff. Interestingly,
Yeah.
you talked earlier, Joe, about are these parties really, was this just some construct of Ed's imagination? Talks about how Henrietta does this bartending bit nearly as a gig, as a job,
Yeah.
nearly every night of the week. Henrietta is at one of these
Well,
lesbian parties. Do we ever know whose place they're at this particular
no, I
party?
don't
I didn't think so. Right. There's
know,
about
but
20 lesbians it's described. So think about that. If she is hooked up with, made arrangements in this one evening's party to hook up with 10 of those lesbians, that's probably most of the passives, the femmes, and
well, yeah.
so Paula's had a pretty good. It's a pretty good haul for Paula in
Well,
terms of sexual fulfillment.
I think Ed was actually a pretty social guy himself. I think
Mm,
Ed liked to party, and there
yeah,
are a lot of pictures of him at get-togethers, and of course these always go around in Ed Wood forums and groups, because generally wherever you see Ed, you'll see the main stars of his films, at least two or three of them, or people who have been in his movies are often partying with him. And I'll assume that Ed must have known some lesbians. I mean, there must have been somebody in his social circle. I mean, I know for sure that he knew some gay men. I mean, there was, um, so whenever you see, but the thing is about Ed's parties, or the parties that Ed was attending, is they never look. I would never say that they look glamorous or sexy. It looks like everybody is bombed out of their minds, and everybody is always sort of slumped over, and they're leaning on each other, and they're just sort of, everybody is blotto in these pictures. And that's what I think happened. I think if he was going to invite, I don't know, I'm inviting Chris and Mona McKinnon and Paul Marco over, um, maybe Kenny Duncan. And what we're going to do is
I'm gonna get fucking hammered. Right,
absolutely, they're going to get
right.
drunk beyond,
Yep.
beyond the time barrier here. We are going to get drunk into the next dimension. So when you see him in these pictures, and I love to see the pictures, I'm glad when people
Yeah.
share them when they find them. But it's not what you see in this story, which is like, the sexy people getting together for
Do
for
you
a
know the
party.
pictures? You know the pictures where Richard Bojarski, writer Richard Bojarski, comes by
Yes,
and hangs out for an afternoon with Ed and interviews him about Bela Lugosi
right.
to write an article. And there's pictures of the two of them together outside of Ed's apartment building, sitting like on the back stoop and things like that. And
Yeah,
Ed's got his arm around Bojarski at one point, and
yeah,
Bojarski looks like, I am about ready to fucking die. I'm so fucking hammered, right?
exactly. And
Right.
um, in one of the documentaries, they visited that place as it used to look, and it's been fixed up now. I believe it's like student housing or something now,
Right. Right.
but it was really dumpy and kind of scary looking at the time. So yeah, there was nothing. Yeah, I think they're been described as crawling around on the floor. They were so
Right.
drunk with Edwin and Richard Bojarski. I think they were. And the thing, you don't get any description of what any of the characters are eating at the
No, they're just
party,
drinking. They're
just
drinking,
drinking.
and they
And
as soon as they have in the space of 5 mere pages, they have
well,
multiple
multiple
drinks,
drinks.
right?
But see, that was one place where I think Ed's parties kind of fell down, was in the food, because when you describe what Ed was, whenever I hear descriptions of what Ed served to his guests, it's always like canned spaghetti and stuff like that. I was like, oh God, canned spaghetti. I don't know. I now I come from an Italian family on my mother's side. We couldn't deal with we couldn't do we couldn't deal with cans with like I guess I'm guessing Eddie had like spaghettios or something that he was serving.
I was that was crossing my mind. I like SpaghettiOs still. I still every now. That
Well,
sounds
okay.
like blasphemy to you, but Chef Boyardee, by the way, Joe, Chef Boyardee is from the vicinity here in my part of the world in
Oh,
northeastern
cool.
Pennsylvania, and he was actually an arts patron. Chef Boyardee, the actual Chef Boyardee, was widely noted here
Well,
locally as an arts patron who would, fund kids to go to art school in New York to sing opera and things of that nature. Yeah.
well, Eddie was big into the canned foods because it was like all. I mean, it was what he could afford. But I, you know, um, Steve Apostolov tells the story of sending out Eddie with money to buy food for a wrap party. And of course, Eddie comes back with one bag of pretzels and the rest all spent on alcohol.
Mm-hmm.
And he's like, Eddie, what are you doing? You're supposed to buy food. And I said, I bought food.
Yeah.
And it's like, well, you bought one bag of pretzels. By the way, we should be mentioning that we are recording this on November 1st, the El Dia de los Muertos, a day of celebration in her country, as they say in Orgy of the Dead. I couldn't help but think about that, is that we're recording this on the Day of the Dead. Apparently, Day of the Dead actually goes on from today until tomorrow. And of course, today I had to re-listen to the Orgy of the Dead soundtrack album, which is still available somewhere in the world, I'm sure. So I had to listen to the Orgy of the Dead soundtrack music, and put me in that El Dia de los Muertos kind of spirit. And I thought, oh, how wonderful that we're talking about an Ed Wood story on El Dia de los Muertos. The one question I would like to ask you, now this was from, what was it called?
Tailgate.
I want to call it Tailspin or something. That's a Disney show, was Tailspin. Tailgate. And is that meant to be like a pun on a piece of tail, or
something of that nature? It's meant to sound a little bit dirty.
A little bit dirty.
Actually, the pictures throughout the magazine.
Okay.
In some cases, the cover photo, actually, if you look at that article from a year ago with the Caine Richmond story Sappho, you'll see a snap of most of the cover page, and you'll see it's a little nebulous, actually, as you look through the pictures in the issue.
Sure.
Whether there's a little bit of a, I don't want to say trans sort of aspect to it, but you're kind of not sure at some points along the way. The magazine thematically has, again, 3 texts in it. So one is this story, Le Pad, right?
Le Pad.
Another one is Sappho, and the third one is uncredited, and it's an article called "What is Lesbianism?" Yeah.
Now that sounds like another kind of thing that Ed
right
might
needs
have
to be
written.
investigated, right? Yeah.
Well, I was wondering if you had any information on these models who would appear. Did you recognize either one of these models?
No, nobody whatsoever. It's a good question, because I have availed myself of quite a great deal of vintage pornography, and certainly in the course of the last 5 years in the Ed Wood space, but generally in my adult life, I'll confess. And no, I didn't recognize any of these folks, Joe.
Oh, well, what I had to wonder, though, is, as you said, this was a little bit more coherent, and I had to wonder if maybe Ed was either a little bit more sober at this time, or whether Tailgate was actually edited in a more real sense.
That's a great question, and here's my my viewpoint. There's one, I think that's something, actually, if you read a lot of his short stories and articles in the Pendulum magazines, you can actually tell by grammar and punctuation falling apart at certain times along the way. You can almost tell how many drinks Ed has in him at a certain point in the story. This one, again, fairly coherent on the surface. There's one moment where I believe is it Henry/Henrietta, who is quote unquote mascared. M-A-S-C-A-R-E-D.
Well,
so that suggests to me that, and he means, of course, mascarad. But that suggests to me that it was not, in fact, edited. That's one very small data point.
The one weird thing that I found typographically is when they're talking about Henrietta, and Paula says, isn't he ever disappointed? Like somebody doesn't ask him to change? And I believe it's Tom, maybe it's Tom, or is it Jenny, maybe, that she's talking to here. She says, not that I've ever heard of, not even when he tends bar at some square's shindig. He finds a way of getting into drag, even if it's only, and then not only is drag capitalized randomly, it's put into quotes. And there is no motivation for the capital letters, and there is no motivation for the quotes at all.
Right.
So, but the thing that I thought was that he doesn't lapse into. There's one short story that I reviewed for one of these volumes where it's basically just one long paragraph. He didn't bother like dividing it up into paragraphs. And I said I was starting to go buggy-eyed from reading that thing. And I could tell he just, he was just typing it all in one, it's like that gif of Jim Carrey in Bruce Almighty. There's a famous gif of him where he's got the powers of God. So he's answering every prayer in the world, all at once. And of course, new prayers are coming in all the time. And so he's typing very furiously. Well, now a story like this, even as coherent and relatively neat and clean as it is, I can't imagine that it took him more than, I don't know, an hour or two,
Couple
maybe
hours, right?
a couple of hours to write this. But again, I would be very curious to see. It's very, very difficult to determine exact publication dates within a year, like when Nighttime Les actually came out versus when this short story actually came out, because
Well,
had he already written the novel and this is just a little spinoff, or did he write this short story and think, hey, there's some interesting stuff happening here, I could expand this into a novel?
so we can narrow the aperture. We can close the aperture just a little bit, Joe, I think, because Bernie Bloom filed incorporation papers for Pendulum Publishing on April
Sure.
18th, 1968. So if this is carrying a copyright of 1968, we have to sort of logically assume that this is in the earliest first couple months of 1968.
Okay, so
I guess again, this is a lot of
sure.
speculation.
So it's possible then that he wrote this short story and he then turned it into a novel.
Right.
And again, this is one of those things. Well, we've talked before about how necromania exists in three forms. And very confusingly, the novel version of necromania is called The Only House, which is something that has thrown a monkey wrench into the works of many an Ed Wood researcher, because they're like, The Only House, like, because he also made a movie called The Only House in Town that has nothing to do with the Only House novel. But there's three different versions of that story. There's a film, there is a short story, and there is a novel. And you would have probably a better idea of which came first and which came second.
He wrote the short story. Well, the short story is titled "Come In," COME, right? Come In.
Yes.
So a pun, perhaps
Yes.
fun. The short story tells in general shape and form the basic narrative of the film. The novel, on the other hand, and you reviewed that at
yes, I did. I reviewed the novel. I reviewed the short story and the novel.
That gets into biographical details of a sort that go back to his childhood.
Well, yes, he gets into the childhoods of the three main characters, but he's so with it that the main male character, Danny, he gets a different name in the flashbacks. He didn't bother. So it feels like very much something that was shoehorned in. Now, it's funny, a thing about shoehorning in text today that's very easy to do because of computers.
Yeah.
It would not have been so easy to do with paper. I don't know how he was working that. Although I never understand how people wrote without computers at all. So every time I read a novel or a book by anybody, I'm always like, how do they write this if they couldn't just cut and paste and, fix things on the fly? Like,
my impression on that, Joe, is that he always, if he seized upon an idea that was attractive and appealing to him, that he would iterate on it again and again, sometimes in different forms. I don't think he was not the copy and paste sort of person. In fact, it was Leo Eaton, a fellow staff writer at Pendulum, who said Ed was the one guy. Is it? I don't think this is in Nightmare of X. No,
No, no, it's in
it's in
Leo
his
Eaton's article.
in Leo Eaton's article, which he posted himself on his website many years ago. But Leo Eaton talks about how Ed prided himself on actually doing the work, actually doing the writing.
Right.
Other guys apparently got busted for taking the T.K. Peters source and copy and pasting from it to try to create articles and things of that nature for the magazine so they could make a quick buck, but not Ed. He wrote these things all from the ground up. So yeah, if he's iterating on
Yeah.
the and you said it
It's just
yourself,
in his
Joe,
mind. Yeah.
Glenn or Glenda is the template. It's a spin-off
Yeah.
point. If you think of Glenn or Glenda as sort of the foundation, he just builds off of it
Out
for
from
the
there.
remainder of his life, creative life, really.
Right. So yeah, he's still going back to that 20 years after he made it. Um, so even in here, I find little traces of Glenn or Glenda. But yeah, where do you think he got that name, by the way? Caine
Caine
Richmond.
Richmond. So I did inevitably I had to Google it and see. I came up with nothing, obviously, no other writer that I can find on a cursory Google search who was ever named Caine Richmond. But I did come up with there is a Caine Street on Richmond Hill in Ontario. I don't know what that means. It probably means absolutely nothing. There's actually also a gentleman, and this is another story for another day, and long story for another day. But there was a gentleman, one of the performers in one of Ed's sex films whose last name was Richmond, but that's a
Okay.
few years later. So I wonder, did he know that person prior? That's, of course, the person's real last name, Richmond. Of course, there was a pseudonymous element to the name, just like Caine Richmond. I think we're agreeing is a pseudonym for Ed Wood.
Yeah, I would say that Ed is demonstrably obsessed with the book of Genesis. He writes about Adam and Eve and the snake every chance he gets.
Yeah,
And of course, we get the story of Cain and Abel. And of course, Cain was the evil one. So I think Cain might be a name that would, imprint itself on Eddie's mind as being, a sinful person. So if he wanted to write, as a, sort of a devilish, sinful writer character that he's playing, Cain might be a good one. And maybe Richmond would be, wishful thinking on Ed's part, like like this is not only the evil Cain, who's writing this, but he's also wealthy. So,
right.
so
And is he just adopting pseudonyms for fun, right? At
oh
some point,
yeah,
yeah, you
for
have to say
sure.
it's just for fun, because very often he'll use his own name, very often not, across a huge swath of
Oh
textual
yeah.
material. We're talking about hundred. Well, I'm getting ahead of myself many months down the road, but probably 100 plus paperbacks. We know probably around 70 or so right now, but I'm confident there's a good chunk more out there. And then we're talking about, I think he ascribed uh, to himself 1,000 quote unquote stories slash articles. I think it's the
I
number
wouldn't doubt
actually
it.
the number actually
I wouldn't
exceeds
doubt
that.
it. Yeah.
Short picture subjects alone, which are the textual accompaniment to photo features in the Pendulum mags, on his own handwritten resume, and it's verifiable. I've seen enough of the actual photo features to know 716 additional texts of that
Yeah.
sort. And then you've got the subtitles and the loops, and you've got just a, a mind-boggling amount of
Amount of
material.
text.
Hmm.
Um, so yeah, I would say 1,000 is a very conservative estimate. Ed was just always writing, which is why I think there has to be, so much of the anthology books that have been published in recent years, they've mostly come from just a couple of years. They think they've come in like from like 72 around there,
Right.
and that's sort of circling around 72. There's earlier ones and later ones, but they're mostly hovering around a couple of years
Yeah.
where he's super prolific. But um, I would figure once he broke in, we don't know exactly where he broke into the
Right.
magazine game.
Right.
But once he broke into the magazine game, once he established a connection there, uh, I have to think that he was just turning out stories like, uh, Well, one time John Lennon said about George Harrison when George started writing a lot of songs, he says he's writing songs like soft Mick these days, which is some kind of Liverpudlian expression. I never understood what soft Mick was, but Ed was writing stories like soft Mick. So yeah, I'd have to think that, especially because in the 1960s, we should point out that Ed's directing career was dormant.
Right.
So Ed was not making films. Ed was occasionally writing films for other people, a little bit. Um, he would write for Boris Petrov. He wrote for Steve Apostoloff. He wrote for what was the guy, Don Davis. You know, these guys. But that wasn't taking up. First off, that wasn't taking up all his time in the 1960s. And number two, there's no way that even in the crummy places that Ed was living, that was paying his rent.
Right.
And because Ed had two constant needs. He had rent, he needed rent, and he needed booze money.
Right. And
Because Ed
cigarettes. I smoke,
and
so
cigarettes.
you need to have cigarettes. Yeah.
So Eddie constantly needed to have cash coming in. And there's no way that his very meager film work in the 1960s was coming anywhere close to covering his
Totally
expenses.
agree.
So,
well, now it's in Nightmare of Ecstasy, Joe, where I believe it's a quote from Bernie Bloom's widow, in the book. She talks about how maybe I'm misremembering it, but Ed was working with Bernie at Golden State News,
okay,
and that's prior to Pendulum, and so
right.
prior even to, I would presume, Bernel and Associates. And the Bernel, I think, is Bernie and Noel, his son
Yeah,
Bernel,
Bernal.
and not many issues of that that I can
Okay, so were
find,
there,
many issues published by Bernal and Associates, but it was essentially the staging ground for what would become
okay,
Pendulum. But Michael Thievis, of course, criminal from Atlanta,
yes.
criminal publisher of Pendulum. I say criminal because he was on the FBI's most
Oh yeah,
wanted
I
list at
think
one point. He was an arsonist, a murderer, etc. Yeah,
well, that's who you had to do business with when we were
yeah.
distributing this kind of material back then. But so do you think this magazine, this tailgate, did it even run more than one issue,
I
or
don't think it did. I think it
this
ran
was
one
a one
issue.
issue
I found,
special?
doing a little digging in preparation for this conversation, I noted that Taschen Books, the great Taschen Books, German publisher who produces these wonderful sort of coffee table art books, and they publish a lot of books about topics related to sex, many of them edited by sort of a legendary magazine editor, Diane Hansen, who edited magazines like Jugs and Leg Show back in the day. So there was one, the Psychedelic Book of Sex, which actually mentions Bernel and Associates magazines as being a sort of representative example of psychedelic sort of presentation of sex in these sort of hippy dippy magazines from the late
Um,
1960s. And it mentions Nude Rebels and a magazine called Cougar, but I think there's a little bit of conflation happening there in the Psychedelic Book of Sex. Cougar was a publisher, which was, I think, rolled up to Golden State News who was a huge distributor. Golden State News, by the way, throughout the mid 60s, late
right.
1960s, far bigger distributor than Pendulum magazines, by the way. So Nude Rebels, I thought, was a Pendulum mag, so it may have started as a Bernal and Associates mag. There's literally, what I know off the top of my head, is 3 issues that are attributed to Bernal and Associates, and Tailgate being one of them. Yeah.
Well, the layout that in this scan is very, very, very similar to what you'd see
Right.
in a Pendulum magazine.
Yeah.
So what was the cover? Do you know the cover price on this
I
thing?
don't, and I don't have it here handy. It's
No, but these, again, these magazines weren't cheap. So the thing that I was going to say about Ed being more coherent is, or maybe possibly being edited, is there are fewer ellipses than you'd normally would get in an
yeah.
Ed story. He not he doesn't totally lose them. He's got some, but sometimes by the end of his writing career, he's he's abusing the he must have been wearing out the period key on his typewriter because he uses them all the time. So yeah, we don't. I think the only time when it really gets, again, you're mentioning a psychedelic, and I was wondering if there was anything that was a sort of a psychedelic in this story. I don't think there is even. Is
No,
there even the hint of
not
mention of
whatsoever.
drugs?
Nope.
Um, no,
No,
no.
it's
This
it's
is
a booze party.
all booze.
Yep.
But the only thing that sort of that would appeal to the psychedelic mindset, I think, is the very last scene
Right. Right.
in this story. So,
Which, yeah, they express, I'm in love. Paul is in love at this
you
point,
know,
right? Of course, she's
well,
about to embark over the course from what we've heard earlier in the story. In the next 3 weeks, she's going to embark on a torrid run of
yeah, she's going to make an end
sexual
run through the
activity with
lesbian.
half the women at the party. But at this particular point, it's love. Yeah,
The other thing was I just assumed that this is all taking place in Los Angeles, which I'm sure it is,
I didn't even think about it. I agree. If I thought about it for a
because
second, I would assume so.
but again, Ed, I think in the novels, Ed will say Hollywood or he'll say Los Angeles, but in something like this, I don't know,
Yeah.
it's just taking place somewhere. And my other question to you is, did any of the readers of Tailgate actually read this thing, you think?
No.
I would say that they would, because if I had spent the equivalent of I don't know, it's got to be like $30 basically to them, $30 of our money to them. If I spent $30 on a magazine, basically, I am reading every last word in it. I remember whenever I've subscribed to magazines in real life, um, I would read all the articles, even if I hated them. I would, because like, I'm not buying a magazine unless
Well,
unless I'm getting everything out of it. But
I get your point, Joe, but go ahead.
does the story work as erotica?
Oh, that's that question, I would say to a degree, right? I think it does.
Somewhat.
It does kind of the relationship develops. It develops a little bit slowly and sort of.
Yeah.
You don't necessarily expect that it's going to develop. You know that there's going to be sex at some point, but you don't know that it's going to become again so sort of idyllic, and there's going to be so much feeling imbued
Yeah.
into the relationship because he goes the last page of the article. He goes into great detail about. Sort of the feelings, the underlying feelings that they have through both of them, and some of the quotes. He does hit that triadic rhythm with some of the quotes, right? Which
Oh,
again makes me actually think of. You said it earlier. Was he wearing out the key, the period key on his typewriter? Hitting it 3 times, because that triadic rhythm is something in sort of terms of cadence of his writing that comes up quite frequently, and it's rife in the subtitles, to the loops.
it says here, all she knew were the rays of the moon as they filtered through the tree-surrounded valley, and the excited beat of Jenny's heart, which pounded through her naked inner thighs to enter Paula's ears. So I assume then that Jenny's thighs must thus be wrapped around Paula's head if her thighs are
Right,
reaching her
right.
ears. So, um, yeah, I don't even think there's a lot of I don't even think there's a lot of profanity in this one.
No,
I
it's all
don't think
the sex is euphemistic to your
so.
point just now, and it's very, very scant, very brief. It's again
So,
more about how how this makes Paula feel,
well,
this feeling that she gets sort of in the world of of
every
Les
once in a while,
Pad.
I think there's one that Ed wrote called something like "Out of the Fog," where two women meet at a cafe or a restaurant on a foggy day, and they meet and talk, and then they go off to have some kind of encounter somewhere else, somewhere more private. Um, and I think every once in a while Ed could tap into that where he would write something a little nicer.
Right.
So um, now maybe there's going to be a fourth anthology of Ed's stuff. We never know.
Mm.
The vagaries of the publishing world, you never know. As we know, it's difficult to get books published. I would be 100% confident in recommending that this be included in an Ed anthology, and I think it's one that Ed's fans should read. You've mentioned his resumes. I don't think it would appear probably on any of his resumes, though.
No, I struggle with that. That's the concept I struggle with often, and I think to myself that if there is indeed, as I surmise, many other ed texts lurking out there, that by and large his resume was meant to disguise that, to attribute mostly his Pendulum works, because he didn't want anybody to find out to the degree to which he was moonlighting.
Yeah,
It's a surmise. I don't know that. Yeah.
Well, the construction of the anthologies is largely built around that resume, or his multiple resumes, because he had multiple. Yeah. But as we are finding out, even the resume, as voluminous as it is, it doesn't cover everything. And this is one where I would say, well, you see, this is, I was debating with myself whether or not to just include the text of this entire story along with this article.
Yeah.
But then I wouldn't want to step on anybody's toes.
Right.
So I think I will refrain, in the hopes that someday this story can be included in a proper anthology. And I think that's where its true home will be, because
right. Agreed. Yeah, I thought about the same thing, Joe. And
but I don't think it would be right to put it out just on the blog. So but Les which I'm so glad that somebody else thought it was Lepad as well. Well, that reminds me of, they did all these sketches on Saturday Night Live that were called Celebrity Jeopardy, and Daryl Hammond would always play Sean Connery. Yeah. And Sean was always he would always be making dirty remarks, and well, there was one category called Let It Snow, and he said, "I'll take Le Titch now for 200." And Alex would say, "No, that was Let It Snow." "No, it's Le Titch now. That's a strip club in Paris. Le Titch now." So that's what I thought of with Les Pads, with Le Pads. But again, I was glad that because at first when you sent it to me, I thought, what is this, some sort of story in France? But he's done some stuff about France. Yeah. He's done some French stuff. So figuring out that title was the key for me to figuring out the whole story and figuring out the whole mystery of it. So, and then when you said that this story came out in 1968, oh, my heart started singing, because I was like, oh, hallelujah. That's the last piece of the puzzle, because that shows that these same characters were rattling around in old Ed's alcohol-soaked brain in 1968, and he loved them so much. He loved Tommy and Sam and Paula and Jenny and Doris so much, and Henry/Henrietta, that he was like, a short story is not enough.
Right.
They need room to grow. That's
a great, again, it's a superb catch, Joe, because it really, it seals the deal. If anybody thinks that we're just making a surmise based on our own subjective opinions, I think that makes it about as concrete as it can get, which is why I agree with you. Yeah, we withhold this story in the hopes that the folks who ultimately may anthologize another short story, they know how to reach us. We can get them this story, and they can include it, because it should be included as part of the Edward canon, right?
Yeah, I love when you find stuff like this, because this kind of makes my whole week when I get something like this, because every once in a while Ed writes outside of his signature style, or he will leave his tropes behind or his usual obsessions behind. He can if he has to, and he can write in a more straightforward or less exciting or less idiosyncratic way. But sometimes Ed is on full Ed. Ed goes full Ed, and this is pretty much Ed full Ed, except not with the incoherence of the later years. This is like a
Right.
more coherent. So this is one that I think fans would actually very much enjoy, because it gives you a lot of the Ed Wood tropes, and yet it's not so depressing or so baffling that you won't know what to make
Right.
of it. So
Right.
yeah, this is fantastic.
Winner. A winner. We're declaring this one a winner in every way imaginable. So yeah, um, I'll have to check out, obviously, and perhaps we'll revisit the topic generally. But the "What is Lesbianism" article, I obviously need to take a closer
Yeah.
look at from that same issue of Tailgate. Bernel and Associates magazines are a avenue that I think is open to further research. So there's really no end in sight to what we're going to see coming down the pike here. Again, I mentioned early on, there's a lot of exciting things happening in the world of Ed Wood right now, and we will get back
Oh,
to them here at the Ed Wood Summit podcast or over at Ed Wood Wednesdays on the Dead to Rights blog, Joe's superb Dead to Rights blog. So definitely check out all of those venues. And any final thoughts or words, Joe? I think we've about to
no,
wrap this one up.
just to say that there are some very, very exciting Ed Wood projects
Yeah.
on the way. There's stuff that we can't discuss yet because it's not happening yet, but Ed Wood fans, hang in there. If you want new
Right.
and exciting stuff coming your way, new and exciting stuff is coming your way.
In fact, I'll go one better and say things that you thought you would never, never in your wildest could you have imagined. So
It's
there's things coming around the corner here that are literally,
loving it.
if you're a real serious Ed Wood fan, it's going to blow your goddamn mind. Really.
Yep.
All right, so that's a good note to end it. Will blow your mind. So thank you, Joe. This has been great.
Awesome.
I always appreciate how much expertise you bring to the table regarding Ed Wood texts in particular. I don't think there's really anybody out there who is got a better grip on the larger body of Ed's text than yourself. And so
Love to read them.
check out all of Joe's articles over at the Dead to Rights blog at Ed Wood Wednesdays. But in particular, he's reviewed every single short story that's come out in those 3 volumes that we
Yeah.
talked about. And I'm sure if there is a 4th volume, he'll do the same
I'll
for
do it
every one of those
again.
short stories. So thank you, Joe. Have yourselves a great night, everybody. I hope you
All
had
right.
fun and enjoyment watching this podcast, and I hope you found it of some benefit. And we will be back. Thanks. Bye.
Bye.